My name is Mikkel, and I'm going to talk to you about containerizing your Microsoft ASP NET 4 applications. I work as a program manager in Visual Studio. It's my daily job. Some of you might have seen the, I hope all of you saw the keynote Wednesday, when we walked you through some containerization, and this is basically what I'm going to talk about now is sort of an extended version of what we showed you in the keynote. So I'm gonna jump straight out into this. There actually is a tutorial up on our doc page today. I'm gonna give you a link at the end that sort of walk you through the whole tutorial of taking any ASP NET 4 application, put it into a container, setting up your CI/CD to be able to go and deploy that as Windows containers into Service Fabric, which is the best supported path we have today for running your containers in Azure. We'll be expanding the support for running Windows containers in Azure going forward, but this is the currently best supported path we have for you. So the whole idea behind this scenario is that we have all these ASP.NET 4 applications running out today, and the typical scenario is you have your web application running across a web farm, a set of web servers with IIS, and you want to have some more agility in terms of how you can actually operate these containers on a daily basis. So what I have here is I took one of our older applications, sample applications, Fabric and Fiber. You can go and find it on, you can actually find it on Codeplex, which is quite funny because we're shutting that down. So we might move it over to GitHub. But I've taken that and opened it up in Visual Studio 2017. I'm using a preview version now. There is Visual Studio Update 3 Preview 1 has the latest container tooling out there that you might want to use to take this on. But you can also do this in earlier version of Visual Studio 2017. The general release version we had. So this is just an ASP NET framework application that has an MVC application, the web part of it. It has some data access layer class libraries as well. And I didn't do anything but open this in Visual Studio today, and I could now go ahead and debug that running an IIS Express using Edge as my browser set up to. But what I want to do instead is I want to put this in a container and start debugging it locally as well. So we have this add Docker support gesture in Visual Studio 2017. And when you install Visual Studio 2017 and you use the ASP NET and web development workload, you get the container tooling component as part of Visual Studio 2017, so you're all set up for this. There are some other prerequisites you need to install on your machine. It's pointed out in the article, but you need Docker CE, a Docker Community Edition, Docker for Windows, which is the little guy you have around here, which enables you to run, to do the integration between Visual Studio and running containers in Windows 10. So once I've added the Docker support to my web application, what happens in the solution is that we're doing two things. First of all, we're adding a Docker file, you can see down here, to the web project. And we also added a new project, a Docker Compose project. So for those of you not familiar with how these things work, the best thing to think about this is the Docker file describes how your application or the container image is being built. So it's basically sort of a build script for creating the container image. Whereas the Docker Compose file is a way to describe how to run those container images. So there's different declarations in those two files that are sort of targeted at those scenarios. So looking at the Docker file that I have here, what we're doing in Visual Studio is, first of all, we know the project type that we added the Docker support to. So we know that this is a web application. We know it's ASP NET 4. We know that we need IIS server. We know we need ASP.NET enabled. So we're going to add this from statement in the Docker file, which basically means take this container image, which is already out there in the Docker registry, which is called Microsoft/ASP.NET, and then it's 4.6.2 version. And use that image as sort of the base layer to go and build my image with my application on top of. So the way that all these Docker images and containers are built is it's basically just a bunch of layers. And when you go and build your own application or your own container, you just add another layer on top of whatever base layer that you're specifying in the from statement in the Docker file. So we have a bunch of images out there that you can go and build upon. There is the Windows Server Core OS, which is sort of the base Windows Server Core image. And then we have a bunch of images on top of that. We have an IIS, and we have the ASP.NET enabled image here. What else we're doing is we're basically just copying in the output of the application, but everything here is set up from a Visual Studio's point of view, and you don't have to do anything to to actually make this work. So I could go ahead and I could debug this in Docker right now. And we would hope that would work. It would not work for this specific application. And the reason is that the application is using SQL Server. So I need to have a SQL Server available as well to start debugging and running this. Normally, I would just use my local DB with Visual Studio when I'm running on my host. Unfortunately, local DB cannot be reached from within a container. So the easy solution to this, now that we are in the container world, is simply just run a SQL Server in a container next to my application. And this is where the Docker Compose file comes into play. So if we just take a quick look at the Docker Compose file. So remember, the Docker file specified how we build our image. And the image we're going to build out of this Docker file is this image called fabricamfiber.web. So we basically just take your web project name and create a Docker image based on that. So we're setting up a service, as described in the Docker Compose file, using that image and just running that. So what I can do now, and I'm just going to go over to the tutorial and quick copy-paste what I need from there, is I can tell Docker Compose, then whenever you're going to run this application, run 2 containers. So I have my web application container specified up here, and I have my new service, which is my DB container, which is specified down here. So I'm pointing to an image. Again, this is a Microsoft image that we put out with SQL Server Windows Developer in it. And there's some secret sauce some guy found out, and I copied it from the internet, and it actually works, which just set up my SQL container, starts it up, and I can go, because my application has some data initializer, or database initialization in it, it will just go and set up my database and actually populate data into the database. So a few more things we just need to do to actually make this work is we need to specify in the Compose file as well, because this is how Compose works. The main part here is that we tell this container service, the web application service, that it has a dependency on my database service down here. So we put in this dependent on declaration, and we point to the DB service down there. What that means is the Docker will make sure that when we run the Compose file, is the database server will be set up, the database container will be set up first, and once it's ready, it will go and start the next. So we don't get any race conditions and stuff that doesn't work for us. I'm also going to just tell it to go and export port 80 my web application in the situation where I want to put it into remote host. And then the last thing, of course, is we just need to make sure that our application's connection strings points to the database that we're running in the container now. So let me just go and put this in here. This is just a regular database connection string. There's nothing in this. I just changed it for what it was using the local DB up here. So now it's actually pointing to my database container, which is called DB, and I get the user ID and password in there. So now we should actually be able to go and debug this application in containers. And I just started that now. And Windows containers or Windows Server core containers, core REST containers that we're using in these scenarios for ASP NET framework applications, they're not tiny containers like some Linux containers are. They're actually fairly big images. So if this is the first time you're doing this is when you go and get coffee and maybe have dinner and so on and so forth. I think the SQL Server image currently is actually a 14 gigabyte image. The core OS image is a 10 gigabyte image. But once you have pulled those down, as I told about the image, the container thing is layers. Once you've pulled them down once and they're cached locally, you don't have to pull them down again. So you can actually go ahead and do that to begin with before you go through this whole thing of getting your application into the containers. So the tooling is now doing actually building our application for us, building all the dependent libraries that I have, and start doing the compose work and setting up the actual containers. And you'll see here in the output window all the Docker commands that we're actually using to call the Docker host and setting things up. And anytime shortly, we should have the container up and running, and we can start see a web application in Internet Explorer. Oh, sorry, Edge, it is these days. There is some work going on to actually improve the debug speed that we have today, so that whenever we've created the container the first time, and we don't do a recompile of the application, we don't have to shut down the container. We can just recompile and load the new bits into the container. Currently, this doesn't work for the Windows containers, but we will get there very soon and get that up and running. So Visual Studio should be listening to my container new and pinging it and see whenever my application is ready. And there it is. So you can tell from the IP address, I'm in some internal VNet container thingy set up. So Visual Studio also knows what IP address my container is actually getting. So this is actually the Fabricam Fiber application now running inside a container and just talking to a database running in another container locally. And I will be able to do breakpoints. I don't have a good breakpoint, but I will be able to do the debugging. We showed you that in the keynote as well. I'll be able to go and debug even in this container if I have multiple containers running at once. And just to make sure that we do prove that we're running in containers, you can see by running a docker ps command, which lists all the Docker containers that I'm currently running on my Windows machine. You can see I have my web in a dev version, and I have the SQL Server running as well. So both of those containers are now running on my machine. OK, so that was the quick getting from my ASP.NET 4 application, now having it containerized. And I set it up to also run my SQL Server in Docker, as a container, sorry. Now, I probably don't want to run the database in a container when I move into production. I might want to use some other service or something like that. So for those scenarios, we do provide some additional compose files in your solution that you can set up. So you can have different compose files that you use for a local debug scenario and compose files that you use when you go and deploy these things into production. So when you set up your deployment pipeline, you would then probably have a compose file not specifying the database, and then making sure you have the right connection strings using web config transformations or something like that. OK, so now that we have this application put into a container and we can run it locally, we also showed you some new configure continuous delivery functionality we've made inside Visual Studio. And hopefully the login of the Azure thing works now. There were some issues earlier today, I've heard. So when you need to move these containers from your local environment and into an environment where it gets hosted, containers have the concept of registries. So it's sort of the build and the release part is two steps there. So when we go and build, we build our application and we create the container images. I can show you over here in Visual Studio Team Services how that works. This is a build pipeline. This is actually a build definition that we created in Visual Studio Team Services. So if you would go and set up a new build definition in Visual Studio Team Services today, there is something called ASP NET with containers, which is a template we created for you. So let's just quickly round off on this guy. So what this configure continuous delivery dialog in Visual Studio is doing is it's going to create everything I'm going to show you from now on. So Visual Studio Team Services build and release definitions, container registries in Azure that you need to store your containers, and finally set up the build into Service Fabric cluster. It doesn't build a Service Fabric cluster, but in the tutorial, there are some easy commandlets to do that for you. So this is just an easy way for you to not have to go into Visual Studio Team Services, find the right build definition, find the right release definition, and all of that, making sure authentication and everything gets up. This will do it for you. So going back to the build definition, ASP.NET with containers is the one you want to use. And when we create one of these, this is what you get. You get some standard NuGet restore and some solution build for Visual Studio MS Build, as you would have done with your application, even if it wasn't in containers. And then we have these Docker Compose tasks that are new tasks in Visual Studio Team Services. They're still in preview, some of these. And we're basically doing three things here. First of all, we are building the services. So the service is defined in the Docker Compose file. You saw we had the web service, we had the DB service defined in there. We're building all of those, creating the container images. Then we are pushing the images to the container registry, where we sort of store the final version that we later going to run. This could be any container registry, public or private. There is the Azure Container Registry that is, of course, in Azure, so it will be close to your host. And you can set that up with service principals and everything, securing it with inside Azure as well. And finally, we're doing we're actually changing the compose file to make sure that the actual digest of the image we're building is the one that we're going to put in the compose file and actually deploying. So this is sort of an extra step to make sure that you get the right version once you deploy those. Docker has this concept of tagging images. as you, this is the container I was running locally in my machine, and you can see we tagged this with a dev. And actually, this container doesn't contain your application code, just to optimize the developer flow. But that version that's how Docker versions container images, by using these tags. What we're making sure in the build pipeline is that we don't reference an arbitrary tag that could be any container. We actually reference on the specific digest of the container image that you have just built, just making sure that it's the right one you get when you go and deploy again at a later time. So that was built. Release to Service Fabric is fairly easy. Service Fabric has a preview version out that supports Compose. So the Compose file that just came out of our build pipeline, we can hand over to Service Fabric, and Service Fabric will go and download those images, container images from the registry, and start running your applications based on all the declarations we had in the Compose files. And you can see the integration with the registry to make sure that authentication between the cluster and the registry, it's all secured by service principals within inside Azure. So there's no need to flow any username passwords throughout this. It's all taken care of for you. That one expired. Let's move on to this guy. So this is the scary Service Fabric Explorer. If anybody of you worked with Service Fabric before, Service Fabric Explorer is sort of a UI, web UI we have to give you some insights into what's running in Service Fabric Explorer, Service Fabric. Before digging too deep into this, let me just point out what's relevant. We have a cluster, 5 nodes, 2 applications. One of our applications is it's actually another, it's the one we showed in the keynote, the visitors application. It has 2 containers running, as you can see. And you can see each of those containers run on a node. There's a node number 2 and node number 3. And this is where the whole power of this thing sort of comes to life. Because just imagine this web application you had running in your IIS web servers today, across a web farm, 4 or 5 servers, 2 servers, whatever it is. Now that these are just containers running in this cluster, we can do fun stuff like, say, we don't want 1 of these, we actually want 3 of these guys. So I just told the cluster, instead of running just 1 instance of this container, just give me 3 of those and scale them out. And you can see the cluster picks 2 new nodes to stand up a new container instance of each of these. So we just, increased the capacity we had for this application by running on 3 instances instead of just 2. So that was fairly easy, right? Scaling out the application. The other thing we can do is, let's imagine that node number 3 for some reason restarted or went down. So I can just go and trigger a restart of the node right here. This container up here, which the cluster knows that it should run in 1 instance. Because we're restarting that node, of course the container instance goes away, but the cluster knows that there needs to be 1 instance of this container running. So we'll find another node to run the container, which is what it just did. So this whole scaling, resiliency, high availability things that you get by putting these ASP.NET 4 applications into containers and being able to run them in a cluster orchestrator like Service Fabric is really, really the power where you can move these applications forward. So this application that I showed you here that we also showed in the keynote, you can think of that as the Fabricant application I just showed you before. You have an ASP.NET 4 website that's part of this. So the story we try to tell here is that once you start doing this with containers, and maybe you want to grow your applications into be like more agile, into breaking down this as a monolith and start breaking out individual services, maybe try to move this into microservice architecture. The good thing now that we run stuff in containers is that we can do so, and we have great choice in how we're going to do this. So what I've actually done with this application is that the old web application running here, I wanted to add some new functionality to integrate that with a CRM backend system. So instead of just building out a new controller within my ASP.NET 4 application, I created a new ASP.NET Core application up here. So this is an ASP.NET Core web API where I actually did that functionality of integrating with my CRM service. And because these are containers, I don't have to do, and they have their isolation, I don't have to use the same technology stack. This could have been Node.js or whatever I wanted to do that in. So I can add new functionality to these older technology stacks via new containers in whatever technology I want to use there. And as I showed you before with the compose file, it's just another service that I reference in here, and I can start building out my applications with multiple services that way. Time check? Huh? Okay, we got a bit more of time. We got a little bit of time. That's good. So the last thing we want to show is that multi-container applications, if you get to that point, in Azure and application insights, gives you this great, has all the capabilities to make sure that you can monitor everything from even the VM level running in your cluster, which is what I'm showing here. I'm showing CPU from the individual nodes running my Service Fabric cluster. I can also get the CPU utilization of the individual container running in those clusters. And finally, using Application Insights SDK, I get this application map where I can see the dependencies between containers and how that all work, and where I can go and drill into failures and stuff like that. So this is all things that work throughout the whole monitoring suite that we have in Azure, Application Insights, Azure Monitor, Windows Azure Diagnostics, and all of that. And you get this great analytical Application Insights feature as well, where I can actually go and write queries against all the metrics being pulled in from my systems. So what I'm showing you here is that I've looked at the Docker CPU count of the individual containers, so how much CPU utilization is the individual container running. And I put this on a timeline, and I'm actually looking across the number of instances of container I have, just based on the container image. So these were the two images you saw before, and you saw the, yeah, this is pretty funny. You saw the ASP NET thing up here, and you saw the .NET Core thing down here. So you can read what you want out of that graph, but you get deep analytics and great insights to figure out how things are running, even though we are now in containers. So it's a lot of stuff, but with the tooling, Visual Studio, right-click, add Docker support, setting up VSTS using the build and release definition that we have provided for you, you're off to a very good start. And AKAMS ASP.NET, it's either ASP.NET 4 containers or it's ASP.NET 4 containers, you decide. Links to the tutorial where you can actually go through the Fabric and Fiber application that I showed. It tells you what prerequisites to download and how to walk through and containerize that and set up your continuous integration delivery. Even how you set up a one-node Service Fabric cluster in Azure to try out some of the Fabric functionality. You won't be able to do failover on a one-node cluster, so you have to create a three-node cluster to do that, but you can try this out. And then take your app. A lot of you have these apps, right, today, and you can try to do it with your own app. There's stuff you need to work on, but the basis of getting there is there for you. Thank you.